Testing times, conflicts and crises leave new questions hanging over the United Nations. With so much power in the hands of 5 member states, can it really help when it matters? From North Korean missiles to Myanmar's persecuted Rohingya, millions of people are looking to the United Nations for leadership. But is it willing to act? We'll have reports from Syria, Iraq and Bangladesh looking at the cost of inaction. I'm Rita Fakhri with a TRT World special asking if it is time for change at the UN. Hello and welcome from the United Nations headquarters here in New York, the setting for this week's high-level meetings and high-pressure speeches at this year's UN General Assembly. Now, while some of the leaders here talk tough on North Korea and Iran, millions of people around the world continue to suffer in humanitarian catastrophes from Myanmar to Syria to Yemen. And the UN and its all-important Security Council member state stands accused of watching on. Now, many would argue that things around here have to change. The UN is under pressure to show that it can represent the whole world, not just the 5 nations who wield so much of the political power. On this program, we'll put the UN under the spotlight and look at what comes next if it fails to adapt. Its future and the need to reform, a key talking point among many of the leaders here.
Tüm bu gelişmeler ve yaşanan insani trajediler Türkiye olarak dünya 5'ten büyüktür diyerek sembolleştirdiğimiz Birleşmiş Milletler Güvenlik Konseyi'nin yeniden yapılandırılması çağrımızın haklılığını teyit ediyor.
Excellencies, we need to reform our world, and I'm committing to reforming the United Nations. Together, we have embarked on a comprehensive reform effort to build a UN development system to support states in bettering people's lives, to reinforce our ability to safeguard people's peace, security, and human rights, and to embrace management practices that advance those goals instead of hindering them.
The success of the United Nations depends upon the independent strength of its members. To overcome the perils of the present and to achieve the promise of the future, we must begin with the wisdom of the past. Our success depends on a coalition of strong and independent nations that embrace their sovereignty to promote security, prosperity, and peace for themselves and for the world.
Now, supporters of the UN will tell you it is the best hope for resolving conflict. Its critics would say it needs to fix a major injustice of its own. John Brain has the Bigger Than 5 briefing.
Nearly 200 countries sharing a vision of equality and mutual respect in the cause of maintaining world peace. It would be hard to argue that the United Nations has come even close to fulfilling its lofty ideals. It certainly hasn't achieved peace around the globe. Barely a day has gone by since its creation when there wasn't a war somewhere in the world. For 6 years now, the UN has repeatedly tried and repeatedly failed to end the conflict in Syria. Critics say that's just one example of the organization's failure.
I think the main problem with the United Nations is that in many cases it's simply toothless. It has a lot of bodies that are in charge with, for example, shedding light on climate change. But it doesn't have any enforcement power, really. It has a valedictory power, in a sense, over its members. It can encourage them to do things, but it can't, even under Chapter 7 resolutions in many cases, can't force them to do things.
But the UN has had some major successes, particularly in alleviating crises through its humanitarian efforts. And it offers perhaps the only viable forum for at least attempting to tackle major international issues. But many believe the organization is hamstrung by a structure that gives the real power to a very select group of nations. There are 193 countries in the UN, but only 15 of them are on the all-important Security Council. 10 seats on that council are for non-permanent members who serve 2-year terms. The other 5 countries are permanent members: Russia, the United States, China, France and the UK, a privilege that goes back to the aftermath of the Second World War. These 5 have a veto, They can block any Security Council vote and regularly do. For example, Russia has used its veto 133 times, the US more than 80 times. And the veto has been a long-running source of grievance here, one that's often seen as undermining the very legitimacy of the United Nations. There are growing calls for it to be scrapped altogether. But without it, it's very unlikely the major powers of the time would ever have agreed to join an international body like the UN in the first place. A former UN ambassador says the veto was and remains a necessary bargain.
Hard to imagine how you undo that bargain in the current circumstance. So, eliminating the veto is everybody's sort of easy solution to how you fix the, quote, broken UN. But the fundamental problem is not the veto. The problem is how do you facilitate, create a consensus among the key members about what the problem is and what the solution is.
What is clear is that the pressure for change at the UN is likely to continue to grow. John Brain, TRT World, New York.
Now, the latest crisis to create alarm here at the UN and around the world is in Myanmar. More than 400,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled a brutal crackdown by the military. Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi, meanwhile, has stayed away from the UN and has again rejected accusations of ethnic cleansing. That charge was leveled by the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. He gave us his reaction to Suu Kyi's speech when we spoke to him a little earlier.
Well, it was interesting. She made it in English, and she didn't speak in Burmese. That was one sort of thing that caught our eye. The second point was that while she made some positive comments about condemning violence and opening up her country to scrutiny, saying essentially they have nothing to hide, unless this is accompanied by actions now where they open up the country to my team, for instance, my office, which I have in Cox's Bazar, these remarks will seem insincere.
Do you have a single UN investigator?
No, we have a team in Cox's Bazar along the border in Bangladesh. They could be ready to move in today if there is sincerity behind what she says. The other point is that yes, it's right to condemn violence in general, but this has all the hallmarks of a campaign, a systematic campaign, and I would have wanted her to address that more directly.
And this is a military campaign, as you say, that's been going on and that's been well orchestrated.
That's right.
For quite a while.
That's right.
Close to 500,000 people.
That's right.
To Bangladesh, if we take the 80,000 who've crossed over last year and the 400,000 according to the latest numbers by the UN. Yet, your boss, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, is hopeful that the situation could be reversed. Can it be reversed?
Well, it can be reversed if all those who were flushed out are invited back in. We worry that these vetting procedures that she spoke of will limit re-entry into Rakhine State to a small number, which will only confirm to us that this was indeed a policy of ethnic cleansing being implemented.
You say she has not allowed access to investigators, that she may do so now. You have called it still a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, the first UN official to do so. What evidence do you have to back up those strong accusations and to back up this term that you've used? Because she keeps saying that this is all fake news.
No, I mean, we had satellite imagery available to us and prominent NGOs as well. We could see the numbers, the scale was quite remarkable. And if this was a counterinsurgency, you wouldn't see numbers like this flee. I sent a team days ago to Cox's Bazar, and they have been reporting to us daily on the basis of the interviews they've conducted. And it's quite clear this is a campaign that has been put together by the military. Of course, to establish crimes against humanity, for instance, or ethnic cleansing, eventually has to be done by a judicial body, and the evidence must be collected. But it has all the hallmarks of an ethnic cleansing campaign.
And you yourself have seen ethnic cleansing up close when you served in the former Yugoslavia.
Yes.
Clearly the UN, though, has been silent, has failed the Rohingya people for several decades. It's not spoken out about their plight. Now the Security Council got involved the other day, but in a very meek sort of way. what needs to be done at the Security Council level?
Yes, I'm glad you raised this. They came out with a press statement, and it was seen to be something that after 9 years there was at least a one voice being expressed by the Security Council. Frankly speaking, a press statement is not good enough. We need a resolution. It should clearly articulate what is required, a stop to the killing, a return of all refugees, and then, in my opinion, there should be penalties if there is if they don't abide by the terms.
I mean,
there could be. I mean,
people have very well entrenched, vested economic interests.
Well, it's ultimately up to the Security Council to decide this. But I think it merits, given the size and scale of what we see and the dangers of this enveloping the entire region, that measures should be taken in case of non-compliance, should a resolution be adopted. But the Council needs to think along those lines.
Are you hopeful that the Council might still act?
I think if we continue to highlight the deep suffering of the people, the Rohingya, one hopes that they will understand that the dynamics are not a good dynamic.
But some human rights activists say that perhaps this needs to be labeled and classified as genocide, and that perhaps would put more of a burden on the Security Council to act.
I mean,
are we there yet?
Well, the evidence basically will decide on where we move in terms of how we describe the international crime that we believe could be committed. When I hear from my own colleagues in Cox's Bazar, and I have to differentiate between my own colleagues here or there and the fact-finding mission that the Human Rights Council has put together. But if we begin to hear that this is what our colleagues begin to feel, we would say so. But at the moment, we're not there yet.
Just finally, High Commissioner, you've been criticised by some, obviously the powerful members of the Security Council, for being possibly too vocal. Meanwhile, the Secretary General of the UN is criticised by many for being too silent. Who's got it right?
Oh, it's an impossible question for me to answer. I'm merely doing my job along with my colleagues who report to us from the field, and we will articulate what we believe the world needs to know in defense of the rights of victims.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, the situation in Myanmar isn't the only one, of course, that the UN is accused of mishandling. In a moment, we'll hear from Alishan Ayanlar in Syria, Nicole Johnston, who is in northern Iraq. But first, we can hear from Shamim Chowdhury in Bangladesh for more on the unfolding Rohingya crisis there.
Tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees have been arriving every day for the past few weeks, escaping the violence in Myanmar. The UN has already described it as a textbook case of ethnic cleansing, and the UN Secretary General has written to the Security Council appealing for an end to the violence. But in this case, it would seem that most likely this is all the UN can do on this matter. And that is because China has already made it clear that it supports Myanmar's security forces in its actions. Added to this, Myanmar has only recently been brought back into the international fold after years of isolation, and as such, it has many new friends around the world.
Nearly 500,000 people killed, 6 million internally displaced, and more than 5 million refugees outside the country. It was at last year's General Assembly at the United Nations where outgoing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon accused all heads of state of ignoring, participating, and in some cases even carrying out the atrocities against the people of Syria. The UN's Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, has described the situation as the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Daesh may now be on its heels in Syria, but as the war nears the 7-year mark, the humanitarian situation in rebel-held areas is dire. The Astana talks with Russia, Iran, and Turkey as guarantors have been able to set up a framework for a shaky ceasefire with the establishment of de-escalation zones throughout the country. But the real challenge in finding a lasting solution will be to get all of the Syrian parties at the same table to negotiate an end to the fighting and find a political solution.
The chaos in Iraq highlights the failure of the international system and the United Nations. In 2003, the UN refused to sanction the invasion of Iraq. The UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, later said that it was illegal. But Washington said it was an act of self-defense under the UN Charter, and it went ahead with it. It also said there were weapons of mass destruction. It later turned out there weren't any. After the invasion, though, the US needed the UN's help, but it wanted to minimize its role here. The US went ahead with an interim government and a de-Baathification law. That led to an insurgency in Iraq and many years later to the creation of Daesh. 6 years ago, the United States withdrew its troops. Recently, it sent a number of them back here in the war against Daesh. The United Nations has been here the whole time, trying to pick up the pieces and help more than 3 million internally displaced Iraqis.
Now, one person who knows all too well the inner workings of the UN and its failures is Dennis Halliday, a former Assistant Secretary General. He served as UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq in the late 1990s. I spoke to him earlier about the need for reform. We've been hearing about UN reform for the last decade or more, as you know. Many people talk about reform, the need to change things at the United Nations, but as long as you have most of the power controlled by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, is there any point in talking about reform?
In my view, reform has got to start at the top. Other forms of reform can come later, throughout the system, whatever it is, but the top is the Security Council, not the Secretary General, the Security Council, dominated, as you suggest, by the 5 permanent members who have veto power.
But so how do you create that change? I mean, do you make the P5 give up their veto power? Is that even something that is feasible?
Well, I think we'd have to talk to the General Assembly, we'd have to talk to the non-aligned movement and explain that they need representation. And this management of permanent seats was created by the 5 powers themselves. It's self-appointed. It's nonsense. It has to be changed.
And how would you change it? What would be the secret to the best kind of reform that we could see at the Council?
Well, I believe we have to have, as I said, non-aligned movement representation in the Council. We need North-South representation. So what we could do is break it up into regional groups. So, for example, North America would have 1 seat. Canada, United States, and Mexico, and one of them would sit on that seat. Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa would have 1 seat. It could be Nigeria, it could be Swaziland, who knows? And they would represent their group and their region. Same for South Asia, same for Middle East and North Africa. In other words, the whole world would have a voice in the Council which represents and talks about peace and goodwill and all the things we attach importance to.
And you worked for the UN for many years. Could you see this happening? Could you see the P5 sharing power with newcomers, with the likes of India, with a representative from the Muslim world, from the Sub-Saharan African world, from Latin America? Could you actually see this happen?
Well, I believe in majority rule, and I think if we have any democracy at all, it resides in the General Assembly. And I believe the vast majority of the member states in the General Assembly would endorse change and reform and sharing the burden of permanent seating. And you would get very different decisions. I mean, as you know, I worked in Iraq. I saw what the Security Council did to Iraq. The United Nations Security Council, member states, 5 permanent member states, we killed 500,000, maybe 1 million people, most of whom were children.
And what do you make of the criticism that's often leveled at the P5 countries, as we know, when it comes to their human rights record around the world? Is that fair criticism, that they're the ones, they're the countries where the power resides to act on peace and security, to uphold human rights, in other words, around the world, yet are they the best place to do so?
No, I don't think so. They are the neo-colonial regimes. They are the most dangerous people on earth. They're the ones who pursue military aggression, every one of the 5 without exception. I mean, they're the ones who, I think, have corrupted the Security Council, corrupted the UN Charter, and it needs to be changed. And if we have the countries that manufacture and sell weapons, the arms dealers in charge of peace, there's obviously something wrong with that, that model. We need to get the world in charge of peace, along with the big powers, of course, as well.
How hopeful are you that things can change at the UN in a way that would keep the organization relevant, that it would restore its authority, make it more credible, more representative in the world for someone who has worked for so long within the organization? Are you hopeful at all? And what would you consider to be the UN's biggest failure?
Well, we have failed in Iraq, we've failed Libya, we've failed Syria. Where haven't we failed, you might say? Our peacekeeping is perhaps the best thing we do, and that we must continue and expand and have a more aggressive role, perhaps. But we do need to see, I think, the permanent 5 changing their position, not pursuing vested interests, not selling weapons where they shouldn't be sold. You know, everybody understands defense. You sell weapons to the Saudis who are destroying Yemen and people are dying as we speak. That's clearly not compatible with membership of the Council or the UN Charter or international law generally. So we've got to just change the mindset of the member states to come and work with each other, big or small, doesn't matter. Try democracy, at least try north-south representation, and get decisions where we don't persecute the weak and the poor and the countries that we don't like and the dictators we don't want. That's not our business. That's a bigger issue. It's not to be controlled by Washington or London or Berlin or, not Berlin, sorry, Moscow or Beijing or Paris.
Dennis Holliday, thanks very much. The cost of doing nothing or not doing enough has been made clear in some dark period since the UN was created. Time and again, it has been accused of failing to act while disasters play out.
The Rwandan genocide of 1994 saw 800,000 people killed in just 100 days. UN peacekeepers already on the ground sent warnings to the Security Council, but no action was taken. In 2003, Sudan was mired in conflict. After a series of defeats, the military began using a militia group, the Janjaweed, to attack minorities in Darfur. It would be 3 years until a small unit of UN forces were sent in. By 2010, 300,000 people were dead. In power from 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge executed one of the largest genocides of the 20th century. More than 2 million Cambodians were murdered before the regime was ousted. But Cold War politics denied the victims justice, with the UN refusing to recognize the new government. In July 1995, more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim boys and men were slaughtered by Bosnian Serb forces, while United Nations peacekeeping forces looked on. Around 700 Dutch soldiers were in the area. They would be witnesses to the biggest war crime in Europe since the Second World War. The Palestinian-Israeli question is one of the UN's longest unsolved problems. A UN resolution from 1967 sets out the land entitled to the Palestinians, but after 50 years of occupation, the struggle goes on.
So how can the UN reform? Well, there are a number of different ideas being put forward for an overhaul of the UN. One is to scrap permanent membership on the Security Council and the veto power, no more Big Five. Another is to make the Security Council bigger, possibly with 20 or more countries. A 2/3 vote would be needed in the General Assembly before the Security Council could agree to sanctions or take any military action. And nations could appeal to an international court against decision made by the Council. So lots to talk about with our guests. Akshaya Kumar is Deputy UN Director at Human Rights Watch, and Reza Afshar is Policy Director at the Independent Diplomat, a think tank here in New York. Thank you both for joining us. Akshaya, obviously everyone knows the major problem with the UN is the fact that the organization is often held hostage by the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. We've seen the competing interests leading quite often to paralysis within the Council. Just look at the case of Syria, with the war in its 6th, 7th year since 2011, close to 500,000 people dying there, no movement at the Security Council. The situation in Yemen, another classic example of Security Council inaction with statements of grave concern at best. And of course, we know the situation in Myanmar as well. How do we make sure that this organization lives up to the ideals of people across the world and lives up to the 3 words within the Charter, we the peoples?
Well, you pointed to exactly the problem that we struggle with every day, which is that too many permanent members are willing to politicize these issues when they really should be putting prevention and ending mass atrocities at the forefront. One of the ways that we've tackled that is by going around the Security Council. In the case of Syria, last year, we appealed to the entire General Assembly. We said, look, the Security Council can't agree to act in the interest of justice for Syria's victims. Will you, 193 members of the General Assembly, take action? And they did. In December, they set up a special mechanism to investigate the crimes that have been committed in Syria. Maybe it's time to look at the same option for Myanmar, where we expect that there will be almost 500,000 people pushed from their homes by the government's campaign of ethnic cleansing.
If you count the 80,000 who've crossed over since last year and the close to 400,000 Rohingya people, yes, I mean, we can expect 500,000 easily. What would you like to see done differently within the Security Council when it comes to the situation in Myanmar, Reza? And is the Security Council often focusing on the wrong issues, would you think?
I think the Security Council has an opportunity now to demonstrate that it will take this situation seriously. And I do think that I understand what Akshay is saying, but ultimately dealing with crises decisively does require the Security Council. It's the system that we have. It may not be perfect, so it does need to work.
When you've got the 5 major powers with vested interest in each of these
so when you talk about failure,
countries,
when you talk,
definitely in Myanmar, how do you expect them to act?
When you talk about the failure of the UN or the failure of the Security Council, you're really talking about the failure of member states. And in order to move these issues forward, member states have to decide to apply leverage and actually decide that they're going to exert the political will to make something happen in the council.
But it's not all member states, of course.
Yes,
and
the P5 are key in that. And the P5 members of the P5 do have the ability, for example, to exert leverage over Russia or leverage over China if they choose to use it. So Myanmar is a good example where leverage needs to be brought to the table to test the Chinese, to see if something can be done to demonstrate to the government of Myanmar that its actions are unacceptable.
And instead we have a lot of focus, Akshaya, on other issues. You yourself mentioned at the top that the issues are often way too politicized. I mean, we hear Donald Trump come to the UN and talk about North Korea and ratchet up the pressure there, and Iran. But does that really reflect how the rest of the membership of the UN wants to see the organization focusing?
Well, I think many people are rightly concerned about the non-proliferation threat presented by North Korea, but there have been, almost uncountable numbers of meetings on that issue. And what's shocking is that in contrast, on a situation like Myanmar with the Rohingya, we haven't had a single open public session of the UN Security Council to discuss this issue. And I agree with Reza that it's time to really put the Chinese on the spot. One of the easiest things the Council could do would be to throw open its doors and let the world see what the Chinese are actually saying. What are they objecting to? And would they really be willing to use their veto on an issue this dire? Are they willing to take that step? I hope they're not.
Reza, how crucial is it for the UN Security Council to operate in a more transparent way? Akshaya talks about the needs for open sessions. We know that all the meetings that have taken place on Myanmar, for example, have been behind closed doors. And we look at the way the Security Council has focused in its resolutions so far this year. There's been close to 40 resolutions issued. Almost half of them have dealt with countries with majority Muslim people in them, and the other half almost has been focused on Africa. Do we have the right balance?
So I think there's two issues around transparency. The first is that it is important sometimes to make sure that, as we've discussed, to expose some of the arguments that are out there in a public session. But public sessions are also choreographed. So sometimes you do need that private session in order to exert leverage, in order to do deals, and in order to break the deadlock. But the second thing about transparency is the Security Council would do much better if it was forced to have to listen to the people who are most affected by conflict. So actually engaging them directly will lead you to better solutions.
So how do you achieve that? How do you engage people directly?
One of the things that we've seen recently is a council that has on occasion invited activists and civil society speakers to brief them directly. So in May, we had a Yemeni woman come before the council and speak about how difficult it is to live in Yemen today with the unending Saudi bombardment, with the Houthi Saleh forces shelling neighborhoods, with schools and hospitals being attacked. And hearing directly from a person who's affected by the conflict like that happens just all too rarely in these hallowed halls. You have diplomats, you have heads of states. You don't often hear from the most marginalized or affected people.
In a nutshell, just final thoughts on this. What would you like to see happen? How hopeful are you about the future of the UN unless drastic change takes place?
I'm actually an optimist on this. I think that the Security Council can work, but it's up to member states to bring the leverage to the table. It has happened in the past, it's happened on plenty of conflicts in the past, it is possible, but the political will needs to be there. I think we're going through a bad patch at the moment in terms of people's willingness to bring that to the table, and I would like to see that change.
From my side, I think the UN has great potential. Right now, it's been cornered in many ways by the US administration's hostile rhetoric and threats of pulling out funding. And it's not just the US. The Saudis have also threatened to use financial leverage to get their way. For the UN to retain its promise as being a voice for the people, it needs to speak unequivocally and independently, regardless of these financial pushes.
Akshaya Kumar, Reza Afshar, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
One of the UN's most controversial peacekeeping missions is about to end. Troops in Haiti have been accused of harming the very people they were sent to protect through sexual abuse and a massive cholera outbreak. Now, for many people, it is a toxic legacy, as our Latin America correspondent Annalise Borges reports.
Haiti will soon bid farewell to one of its most controversial guests. Peacekeepers with the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti are pulling out after 13 years in the country. We tagged along the Brazilian military wing of MINUSTA on the last few days of their deployment to Haiti, a mission they consider a success.
We accomplished our mission. The soldiers did a beautiful job, a tremendous job. MINUSTA it's a case of success in the UN history.
And that positive assessment was shared by the UN Security Council, which decided to pull these troops out of Haiti, deeming the country safe enough. But can this nation maintain peace and stability on its own? Not everyone here is convinced.
This was the scene in the streets of Haiti in 2004. Armed men in the small port town of Gonaïves started what was said to be the beginning of another bloody fight for power in the small Caribbean nation. The former French colony's history had been marked by armed conflicts and political instability, and now Haiti was edging ever so close to civil war. MINUSTA was sent to restore order in 6 months. 13 years on, this is the scene they are leaving behind. Protesters clashed with security forces when anti-government demonstrations turned violent last week. After a turbulent electoral process, which was monitored by the UN and lasted over 18 months, these Haitians now say they want a revolution. The story of MINUSTA is one of controversies. Shortly after the devastating earthquake in 2010, a deadly cholera epidemic hit Haiti. The disease, which killed over 10,000 people and sickened hundreds of thousands, was traced back to Nepalese peacekeepers. But there was more. A report published in January this year revealed hundreds of women and children were raped by UN peacekeepers in Haiti. Over 200 women and minors say they were abused in, quote, transactional sex incidents in exchange for food and medicine.
To me, in any other country, this catalog of offenses would have had them run out and pay compensation, but apparently in Haiti, it's okay for us, and that's not okay at all.
On October 15, MINUSTA will come to an end. There are different views on what the mission has accomplished in Haiti, but it's clear they leave behind a complex legacy, one that offers the UN some hard lessons for the future. Annalise Borges, TRT World, Port-au-Prince, Haiti.
Plenty of questions then about the UN's role in Haiti. Annalise has been putting them to the head of the mission there.
Haiti today is a different place from where the country was in 2004 when the mission was established. The country, in the time that MINUSTA has served, has been able to organize electoral processes and hand over from one democratically elected president to another. President who assumed office in February of 2017, President Jovenel Moïse, and his administration and government have indicated their plans for further development of the country. So I would say that, yes, MINUSTAH has been able to contribute to that stabilization, has been able to contribute to the professionalization of the Haitian National Police, which is a work that is in train. The police are developing further.
I would like to ask you about the allegations of sexual exploitation that some of the locals have made against UN peacekeeping troops. Has there been an investigation, a thorough investigation into those accusations, and what were some of the findings?
Every allegation of sexual abuse and exploitation that we receive is treated in a very serious manner in keeping with the guidelines and the procedures outlined by the United Nations headquarters. In instances where these allegations involve uniformed personnel, the countries concerned, and to request that the sanctions that are applicable are applied to the persons who are found to be responsible for such acts. We have, in the past, when we have had allegations, we have attempted to support the victims through, for example, provision of employment in some cases, and also pursuing actively through our headquarters with the countries of origin of the perpetrators to ensure that justice is done, and to ensure that in the case, for instance, where there are children born of such cases, that there is provision made for these children.
Mrs. Sandra Honoré, this UN Special Representative here in Haiti, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Driving through change will, of course, take strong leadership. At the UN, the top job is held by Antonio Guterres. Here's our profile of the man in charge.
Hello. Antonio Guterres is a veteran diplomat, a former Prime Minister of Portugal,
Solemnly swear
and since January, the most powerful man at the United Nations. Chosen as Secretary General in the most transparent election in the UN's history, it's his job to make sure that the organization stays relevant, and he says that cannot happen without change.
We need to have a strong commitment to reform multilateral organizations, and one of those is the UN. And so I do believe that it is absolutely essential to introduce a very solid program of reforms.
His first 9 months have taken him to a number of different countries, notably to the Gulf to mediate in a dispute between regional powers, and to Israel, where he spoke out against the occupation of Palestinian land. After the violence involving white supremacists in the US, Guterres called on the world to stand up against racism, a remark seen as a veiled criticism of US President Donald Trump. Ultimately, however, Guterres will be judged not just by his words, but by how much meaningful change he can achieve in the organization he leads.
With the election of Guterres almost 9 months ago, there was much excitement, hope, and anticipation here at the United Nations and around the world that he would be the person to fill the leadership vacuum that we have in the world today, that he would effectively restore the central moral authority of the United Nations. But I think it is fair to say that almost 9 months on, much of that enthusiasm has died down. I had the chance to catch up with his spokesman a little earlier, Stéphane Dujarric, and I asked him how effective Antonio Guterres can be if he doesn't speak up more forcefully on some of the key issues.
I think, first of all, he has spoken up. He has spoken up on issues of principle, on key issues, whether it's refugees or migrants, whether it's the rise of xenophobia, whether it's issues relating to climate change. He has been very strong, has spoken out very clearly. I also think the United Nations is its advantage, in fact, is in its multiplicity of voices. We have an excellent High Commissioner for Human Rights who has been very vocal, and frankly, the Secretary General has supported him in everything that he said.
But he precisely, and you're talking about the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid, he has taken the lead when many people look to the Secretary General of the UN to speak up for people whose rights are being trampled on. So on the Rohingya issue, we've noticed that in the last few days, he's stepped up the rhetoric. But he wasn't the first to do so, as I say. He didn't take the lead. But on issues like Yemen, on what's going on there with the number of civilians dying every day, why don't we hear him speak out more clearly and more forcefully?
I think if you looked at the statement that he's issued and even what was said, you will see that we have clearly and continuously condemned the killing of civilians, the bombings that have been done by the Saudi-led coalition. Later this month,
You've never been explicit in your condemnation.
I think we have been explicit. I mean, I speak for him every day. I think I've been fairly explicit. Later this next couple of weeks, he will be issuing his report on children in armed conflict, which I think will be very telling and very explicit on the situation, especially the situation in Yemen.
Well, speaking about this report, Children and Armed Conflict, this has been a controversial report over the last couple of years. Ban Ki-moon, Guterres' predecessor, we know, was subjected to some quite significant pressure from Israel and the Saudi-led coalition waging war in Yemen because of an annex, a blacklist,
a list
of countries and entities that have been accused of targeting children in the context of war. Now I understand that Antonio Guterres wants to do away with this list. Of course, it's a headache for any Secretary General. Is that true? And it is my understanding that this report is put on hold. Are we to infer from this that
no, I think the basic premise of your question, if I may, is wrong. The report is not put on hold. It's scheduled for discussion in the Security Council the start of October. It will go to Council members by the end of this month, of September. The report is not yet finalized. The Secretary General will make the ultimate decision. It will have an annex. It will have a list. And I have full trust that he will make the right decision. But I think
that's what a lot of people are hoping, because they've already seen worrying signs where he's caved in, to put it bluntly.
I don't think he's caved in. I don't think he's caved in.
I just want to draw your attention back to March, where it is a known fact now. He put a lot of pressure on a senior UN official to withdraw a report criticizing Israel in its policy toward the Palestinians. She says, and we all understand, was ordered by Antonio Guterres to withdraw that report. When she refused to do so, she resigned.
I think the report had not gone through the proper clearance channel. And for the Secretary General, it was a question of his own authority, of reports being issued in his name that did not reflect his views and that did not go through the proper clearance channels.
I think if you look
at the report, no, but I think if you look at the reports that he's shown that has been issued since,
he has caved into pressure, and that he isn't willing to stand up. To some powerful nations.
I think the problem is that people look at the Secretary General, his activities, through their own lens. Other sides to this argument have said that there have been too many reports from the Secretary General being critical. I think the Secretary General issues reports in his name that he is comfortable with, that reflect his position. And I think any honest look at all the reports that have been issued on the Israeli-Palestine issue since he came into office, I think will bear up to that. He has not, any Secretary General comes under pressure from many sides, from many countries. That's the difficult role of a Secretary General, someone who faces high expectation, but has in fact very little authority if you look at the charter.
And much of that pressure, in fact, we all know, comes from one specific country, and that is the United States. It seems to me that Antonio Guterres has so far tried a policy of appeasement toward the Trump administration. Do you think it's paid off so far?
No, listen, I think I would urge you to look back at the long speech he gave on climate change and the importance of U.S. involvement in the Paris Agreement, which I think he made clear that his position is not that of the United States. But the United States is also the United Nations' largest contributor. It is key for any Secretary General, and it is key for him, for Antonio Guterres, to be involved and to be in dialogue and in constructive dialogue with the United States. And I think he has.
So we've heard some of the criticisms of the UN so far, but it's had some major achievements too. James Champion has our 5 facts.
UN programs have improved lives across the world. More than 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty since 1990. Children's Fund UNICEF says the lives of more than 90 million children have been saved in the same period. Millions more are alive today thanks to immunization and education about disease. New HIV infections were cut by nearly 40% between 2000 and 2016. But achievements like these don't come cheap. Total UN spending, that comes to more than $40 billion a year. And the 2030 agenda, the UN's plan to hit targets in education, health, inequality, the environment and more, well, reaching them would take an estimated $3 trillion per year.
Well, we can now bring in our guests. Shireen Tadros is Amnesty International's UN Director and a former international correspondent. And Ashish Pradhan is from the International Crisis Group. Thanks to you both for being here. Shireen, of course, the Secretary General doesn't have an easy job. He's got countless humanitarian crises around the world, conflicts to deal with, and now a US administration that's bent on an isolationist, America First policy. Has Antonio Guterres, though, done enough to give this organization the right voice and the right vision?
I mean, you're right. It's known as one of the hardest jobs in the world, if not the hardest job in the world. And don't forget, there were huge expectations for Antonio Guterres. He came in at a time when we were having this sort of right-wing movement across the world and leaders coming in that we were palpitating over, what could happen. And then you have Antonio Guterres coming in and everyone going, phew. So the bar was quite high for him. Has he performed? I think the consensus amongst the NGO community is that he could have done a lot more. There is a certain degree of frustration over the soft diplomacy that he has chosen to do, these sort of closed door meetings, give me time, let me negotiate behind closed doors, that at the end of the day we're seeing crisis all over the world.
Ashish, it's precisely what he says. He might be more effective in doing this diplomacy, quiet diplomacy from behind the scenes, but can he be really effective as a leader if he doesn't speak up more publicly and more forcefully on certain issues?
Certainly, I think striking the balance between that type of closed-door diplomacy and the public statements is something I think that he can improve on. I think even on the, to go back to what Shireen said, even on the private diplomacy, we've seen room for improvement. I think he came out at the start of the year making prevention a big plank of his and getting out there and trying to address crises before they escalate. I know South Sudan was an example that he really emphasized. And he initially engaged with the region, with the African Union, and there were some signs of promise. But ultimately, I think that's fizzled out a bit. I think what we hear in-house now is that the 38th floor, where the Secretary General works, doesn't really discuss these types of crises as much as they should. He has a prevention agenda, but that hasn't really panned out yet.
And of course, he's someone who's highly qualified to do the job, having been Prime Minister of Portugal. He is said to keep his cards quite close to his chest and make many of the key decisions by himself or with a very small group of inner circle around him. But I wonder, when it comes to the geographic representation in the building behind us, on the 38th floor, but also around the United Nations as a whole, he hasn't started with a clean slate, in that he has allowed the P5 countries and a lot of Western countries to keep a very tight grip on some of the key departments within the UN. Should he have changed this tradition?
He's making that a point right now, and especially with the gender parity issue. So he's brought on a lot of women in key positions, and we already can see the effects of that. So actually, I would say that that's an area of Guterres' reform that we are actually seeing some traction on.
Gender parity, though, but not geographic representation, which is a key principle enshrined in the UN Charter itself. Would you like to see him do more? Because we often say how the Security Council is not representative of the rest of the world, but should the Secretariat be as well?
Absolutely, but we all know that, especially when it comes to the key departments of the UN, it's very, very difficult to negotiate this with the P5. In fact, before Guterres was even in his position, a lot of these those changeovers in the main departments, like Department of Political Affairs and also peacekeeping, this was a done deal. So how much room for maneuver does the Secretary General have? And does that mean that we need larger reform so that the P5 don't have this sort of power over these key positions?
You mentioned peacekeeping. Ashish, what are your thoughts about the future of peacekeeping? We know that the Haiti mission is wrapping up, a mission that's been mired in controversy, but peacekeeping in general, also in all fairness, has been one of the success stories, despite the controversies, for the United Nations.
I think that's an area, despite what you said, there are areas that have had success in peacekeeping. There's a lot of reform that should happen. I think there's been a lot written, a lot of reviews that have taken place over the years about right-sizing peacekeeping, about making troops that are peacekeepers perform better. And I think that's been a big part of the US push for peacekeeping reform. And I think the Secretary General has managed to work with them as much as possible. But I think one thing that we've looked at in the last couple of months, including with the Democratic Republic of Congo mission, is how you go about that reform is just as important. It's all good and well to say you'll put the politics first, but the possibility of signaling disengagement when you have a downsizing of troops at a vulnerable time in a country's political situation can mean that you ultimately sort of end up diminishing your influence, having less chips to play in terms of the politics, and then ultimately not being able to really change much about the conflict. So I think, again, reform is important. How you go about that is just as important, and we need to see more from that on the UN side, but also on the Security Council side from the major powers.
How much more engagement, Shireen, do we want to see from the rest of the world? I mean, we've been talking about how the US administration seems to be in retreat on the international stage. Antonio Guterres says the world needs the US to be more engaged, but could it be actually a good thing for the US to be less engaged in many parts of the world?
I think it really depends on where we're talking about in the world. I mean, if our bar is, the Trump administration's policy towards X and Y country being so bad that it's better that they just, release completely, then yeah, sometimes that is a better option. But what we found here is that the absence of the US position on certain countries has made it very difficult for the rest of the membership to react, and it's left the UN unbalanced. I mean, this is a very difficult ship to steer, and sometimes it feels like the Secretary General is just trying to keep it afloat rather than steering it. And that is a large part down to the US and their position. They are extremely powerful in this building.
And if the US does retreat, I mean, could we see another player jump in? China, for example.
I think
when it comes to climate change, they have shown that they were willing to take the lead.
Certainly, on issues like climate change they have, but on other issues, I think a lot of people hoped on November 9th of 2016 that maybe with the possibility of a Trump administration, others like China can step in. I think they're not quite as ready as others would like them to be. They're doing a bit more peacekeeping, committing more troops. But I think they're largely not as willing and not as ready as others would like it to be on other issues, including in South Sudan again. The Brits, for example, have taken a bit more of a proactive approach and tried to fill that void. Certainly in areas of Africa like the Sahel, the French continue to have the lead. So there are actors in certain pockets that continue to hold influence, but we constantly hear from regional players that the American lack of policy is a big, big gap. So that continues to hinder
your
things.
final thoughts from a human rights perspective. What would you like to see more of and less of here at the UN?
I mean, I think generally we're having a crisis in the human rights community when it comes to this sort of international level. And what we'd really like to see, certainly from the Secretary General, is a much more public statement and leadership. We saw what he's been saying on Myanmar, for example, very recently, and the effect that immediately had, not just on the Security Council, but on actual member states of the UN and how they reacted. So this is a very powerful position. We would like to see him use it to the full.
Shireen Tadros and Ashish Pradhan, thank you both very much. Thank you. So everyone here knows that something has to change. The Security Council, as it stands today, is deeply flawed and undemocratic. 5 powerful countries, the so-called P5, deciding the fate of the rest of the world. In fact, many here are talking about the P3, the US, Russia and China, as the real power brokers. The question is, what kind of change can we really expect without either removing the veto power or bringing in new permanent members? And with the US's decision to cut crucial funding, the new Secretary General is seeing firsthand the limitations of his own authority. Now, of course, the UN has been down this road before and it survived. But unless the other 192 member states and the Secretary General unite to counter these pressures and change the status quo, the United Nations will continue to lose its authority and, more crucially, its moral standing in the world. From the UN headquarters here in New York, from Miri Dafakhri and the entire team at TRT World, goodbye and thanks for watching.